The card was already sitting on my plate when I arrived at the restaurant. Not a birthday card, not a congratulations card. I knew what it was before I even touched it, because my mother was watching me from across the table with that specific look she saves for moments she's rehearsed. I sat down, I picked it up. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy stock, the kind you buy when you want something to feel official. My name was written on the front in my father's handwriting, not Sweetheart, not a nickname, just my full legal name, Simone Catherine Bouchard Wells. All four names, like a court document. My sister was recording me on her phone. She didn't even try to hide it. She had it propped against the breadbasket, pointed directly at my face. I remember thinking, they've been planning this for a while. It would help to explain what I'd done to deserve this, at least according to them. 3 years earlier, I'd turned down a position at my father's firm. He's an accountant. Has been for 30 years, runs a mid-sized practice out of Oakville, Ontario, the kind of place where everyone knows your last name, and that matters more than anything else. My grandfather started the firm. My uncle works there. My cousin just joined last year straight out of Wilfrid Laurier. It was always assumed, not discussed, not offered, just assumed, that I would be next. I studied business. I did the CPA prep courses. I smiled at the right dinners. And then, in the spring of my final year at McMaster, I told my father I wasn't coming to work for him. I'd been accepted into a nursing program, a second degree, 2 more years of school, student loans on top of the ones I'd already taken, and a career that paid a fraction of what I could have made at the firm. My mother cried, not sad crying, the kind of crying that's really anger wearing a different costume. My father sat very still, the way he does when he's decided something. My sister, who had just started at the firm herself 6 months prior, said nothing, but I saw her exchange a look with my mother that I still think about sometimes. The next 2 years, I was tolerated at family events. Spoken to in the careful, slightly elevated tone people use with someone they've already written off. My father stopped asking about school after the first semester. My mother redirected every conversation about my future toward my sister's recent promotion, my cousin's engagement, the new client the firm had just landed. I finished my nursing degree in April. I got hired at Hamilton Health Sciences in May. Emergency department, which is where I'd wanted to be since my first clinical placement. It was a permanent full-time position. Benefits, pension contributions, the whole thing. Union shop. It was, by any reasonable measure, a good job. A stable job. A job that mattered. I didn't tell my family right away. I don't know exactly why. Maybe I already knew it wouldn't land the way I hoped. Maybe I was just tired of performing milestones for an audience that had already decided how the show would end. I told them 3 weeks later, at a Sunday dinner at my parents' house. My mother said, "So what does that pay, realistically?" That was it. That was the whole response, which brings me back to the restaurant, the envelope. My sister's phone propped against the breadbasket like she was live streaming a nature documentary. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds. It had been typed, not handwritten, which somehow made it worse. It said in formal language that my father had clearly put some effort into, that they were formally withdrawing all familial obligations and expectations with respect to me, that I should not expect to be included in family gatherings, estate planning, or any financial arrangements going forward, that this decision was final and mutual, though no one had asked me, and that they wished me well in my chosen path. There was a line at the bottom for me to sign, to acknowledge receipt. My sister's recording light blinked red. My mother's hands were folded on the table. She had the look of someone who had been waiting for a reaction and was fully prepared to manage it. My father was studying the menu, which told me everything. He'd done his part, he'd delivered the thing, and now it was someone else's scene. I read the document twice. Slowly, not because I needed to process it, but because I wanted them to think I was processing it. Then I folded it back into thirds, put it back in the envelope, and set it down next to my water glass. I said, "Thank you for making this clear." My mother blinked. "That wasn't the script." I said, "I'll keep this." I picked up the menu. My sister lowered her phone just slightly. She'd been expecting tears, or an argument, or some version of begging. I'd thought about all of those responses on the drive over because somewhere in the back of my mind I had understood, not consciously, not clearly, but understood that something like this was coming. I'd had 3 years to get used to the idea that my family had drawn a line between who I was and who they'd wanted me to be. By the time they handed me paperwork about it, I was mostly just relieved that it was in writing. What I did not say, sitting at that table in the Milestones on Lakeshore, is that 6 days earlier, I had been asked to represent Hamilton Health Sciences at a provincial nursing recognition ceremony in Toronto. I did not mention it because they did not ask. I had been nominated by my unit manager, Carol, which I only found out later because Carol is not someone who makes a fuss about things. The nomination had gone through a regional committee, then a provincial one. The ceremony was part of a broader healthcare recognition program run jointly through the Ontario Nurses Association and the Ministry of Health. I hadn't told anyone outside of work, partly because the whole thing felt unreal, and partly because the people I would have told had stopped calling. I showed up to the event at the Westin Harbour Castles in downtown Toronto on a Wednesday morning in early October. I wore my grandmother's pearl earrings, which she'd left me, and the navy blazer I'd bought myself when I got the job. I didn't know exactly what to expect. Carol had said it would be a nice morning, which from Carol meant somewhere between genuinely meaningful and quite significant. There were about 200 people in the room. Hospital administrators, ministry officials, senior nurses from across the province. I sat at a round table with colleagues from my unit. We had coffee and those little fruit plates that taste like refrigerator. Someone gave a speech about the state of healthcare in Ontario. Someone else gave another speech. Then they announced the Excellence in Emergency Care Award. The citation read aloud was about a nurse who had, in her first year in the emergency department, developed a triage support protocol that reduced patient wait times during high-volume periods and who had been recognized by her colleagues and supervisors as exemplifying standards of care that the profession aspires to. I want to be honest, I had genuinely not understood the scale of what Carol had submitted on my behalf. I had not known it was that award. I had not known that the protocol, something I'd put together in my second month on the floor because the existing process had a gap and it was bothering me, had been formally adopted at 2 other HHS sites. They called my name. My colleague from the department, a nurse named Devin, who has been doing this for 15 years and who is not given to sentimentalities, started clapping before I'd even stood up. I walked to the front of the room. My mother found out the way people find out things now. A journalist from the Hamilton Spectator had been at the event. There was a photograph, me at the podium, holding the award, looking like I wasn't quite sure what my face was supposed to do. The article ran in the online edition 2 days later, and then a regional healthcare newsletter picked it up, and then someone shared it to a community Facebook group in Oakville. My aunt called my mother. My mother called my sister. My sister apparently said, according to my aunt, who is my mother's sister and therefore not always a neutral source, I didn't know she was even doing well. I know all of this because my aunt called me. She called on a Sunday morning. I was making coffee. She talked for about 12 minutes and then she said, "Your parents have been calling around trying to get your number." I said, "They have my number." She said, "I know. They meant to call you directly, I think." I said, "Okay." There was a long pause. I said, "Auntie, I'm going to be honest with you. I have a document in my kitchen drawer, signed by my parents, that says we have no familial obligations to each other. If they want to call me, they can call me. I'm not going to make it easier than that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You've always been the serious one." I took that as a compliment. My sister texted me 4 days after the article ran. The text said, "Hey, I saw the thing in the spec. Congrats, I guess. Mom and Dad feel bad about the dinner. Can we talk?" I read it twice, not because I needed to think about it, but because I wanted to make sure I was reading it accurately. Feel bad about the dinner. Not we were wrong, not we're sorry, not even we shouldn't have done that, Just they feel bad, as if the dinner were a minor miscalculation, as if the thing that had gone wrong was the venue or the timing, and not the envelope with my full legal name typed across the front and a signature line at the bottom waiting for me to acknowledge my own dismissal. I typed back, "I'm glad the article was helpful for you. I'm not available to have that conversation right now. I put my phone face down." That was the part that surprised me, honestly, how easy it was. I'd spent years bracing for that conversation, for the moment where I'd have to choose between keeping the peace and keeping myself. I'd imagined it would feel like a door closing, something heavy, something final. It felt like setting down a bag I hadn't realized I was carrying. There's a particular thing that happens in families like mine, and I say like mine, because I don't think we're unusual. I think we're just unusually honest about our particular dysfunction, where love and approval get tangled up into the same thing, and then slowly, quietly, the approval starts to crowd everything else out. Where you find yourself modifying your choices not because they're wrong, but because they're inconvenient for someone else's idea of who you were supposed to be. I don't think my parents are bad people. I've had a long time to sit with that conclusion, and it's where I keep landing. They are people who had a plan, and they confused the plan with love, and when I stopped fitting the plan, they didn't know what to do with the love. So they put it away. And then they formalized putting it away in a typed document with a signature line, like an addendum to a partnership agreement. The document is still in my kitchen drawer. I haven't thrown it out. My grandmother, my father's mother, who is 91 and who I visit in Burlington every few weeks, called me the Saturday after the article ran. She'd seen it because my cousin had printed it out and brought it to her at the care home, which I found both thoughtful and mildly chaotic. She said, "I always told your father you were going to be something that surprised him." I laughed. She laughed too. She said, "He's stubborn. He got it from his father, who got it from me, so I'm not entirely without blame." She asked me to bring her a specific kind of shortbread from the Portuguese bakery on Plains Road the next time I came, because the care home had switched their dessert supplier, and she was not satisfied with the arrangement. I promised I would. We talked for 40 minutes. It was the best conversation I'd had in months. I went back to work the Monday after the article ran, 12-hour shift overnight. We had a cardiac event in Bay 4 and a psychiatric hold that kept me on my toes until about 3 a.m., and then the department quieted into that particular stillness you only get in an ER between 3 and 6 in the morning when the world holds its breath. Devin found me at the nursing station refilling my coffee and said, "I heard your family didn't take the nursing thing well." I said, "That's a polite summary." He said, "My family thought I was crazy too. Thought I was wasting a commerce degree." He poured himself a coffee. 32 years later, here I am. I said, "Does it get easier, the family part?" He thought about it for a second. He's the kind of person who actually thinks before he answers, which in an ER is both a professional asset and a personality trait. He said, "It gets quieter," which isn't the same thing, but it's something. I thought about that for the rest of the shift. My mother sent me an email in November. Not a text, an email, which in our family is the written equivalent of sending a letter via courier. It suggested that the family would like to reconnect and proposed Christmas dinner at my aunt's house as a possible occasion. It was 3 paragraphs long. 2 of those paragraphs were about my sister's recent promotion. The third mentioned briefly that my parents were proud of my achievements in the medical field. I am a nurse, not a doctor. That's not a complaint. It's a distinction that matters to me because I chose it on purpose, because nursing is what I wanted to do, because the emergency department is where I feel most like myself. Being called medical field in a 3-paragraph email mostly about my sister's promotion was not, shall we say, a ringing endorsement. I didn't reply right away. I drafted 3 different responses over the course of a week. One was long and said everything I'd been storing up for 3 years. One was short and professional, 4 sentences, almost courteous. One was just a single line. I sent the single line, "Thank you for reaching out. I'll need some time before I'm ready for that." My mother did not reply. I didn't know how to feel about that, so I went for a run along the escarpment trail and stopped at the lookout point at the top, where on a clear day you can see the whole sweep of Hamilton Harbor and the lake beyond it, and I stood there for a while watching the water. It had taken me a long time to love this city. I'd grown up in Oakville, which is quieter, more manicured, the kind of suburb that has strong opinions about curb appeal. Hamilton was rougher and louder, and the winters were no kinder, but there was something real about it that I'd grown attached to without noticing. The harbor. The old brick. The way people here got on with things without making too much of a production out of it. I had built something here. Not a perfect life, not a finished life, but mine, in a way that nothing had been mine before, not really. Winter came. I worked a lot. I took on some additional responsibilities in the unit after Carol moved into a leadership position and recommended me to her replacement. I started a process improvement group that met monthly with nursing staff from 3 different departments, small things, incremental things, the kind of work that doesn't look like much on the outside but changes how a place functions from the inside. My grandmother and I had lunch together the 3rd Sunday of every month. She always ordered the same thing, and she always asked me about work, and she always listened carefully, which is rarer than it should be. At one of those lunches in January, I told her about the email from my mother, about Christmas, about the 3 paragraphs, about the single line I'd sent back. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know, when your father was 24, he wanted to be an architect." I said, "I didn't know that," she said. "His father told him accountants make a living, architects make drawings, so he became an accountant." She picked up her fork. He was good at it. But I sometimes wonder who he would have been. I didn't know what to say to that. I still don't, exactly. It's the kind of thing that rearranges itself in your mind over time. In March, my father called. He called on a Tuesday evening around 7. I was eating leftover curry on my couch, watching a documentary about the Trans-Canada Highway, which is not something I need you to understand, but is accurate. I almost didn't answer. I stared at his name on my screen for long enough that it almost went to voicemail on its own. I answered. He said, "Simone." I said, "Hi, Dad." There was a pause, long enough that I almost said something just to fill it. He said, "I saw the article several months ago now. I should have called sooner." I said, "Oak," he said, "We didn't." He stopped, started again. The dinner was wrong. What we did at dinner was wrong. I don't know how else to say that. It was not an elaborate apology. It didn't answer any of the larger questions. It didn't address the years of careful exclusion, or the document in my kitchen drawer, or the sister with her phone propped against the breadbasket waiting to watch me fall apart. But it was also the first time in 3 years that my father had said anything to me that didn't have a correction or a redirect buried inside it. I said, "Thank you for saying that." He said, "Your grandmother says you visit her every month." I said, "3rd Sunday." He said, "She talks about you." I said, "I know. She tells me." Another pause. Shorter this time. He said, "Are you doing all right? Generally?" And I thought about that, really thought about it, the way you do when someone who hasn't asked in a long time finally asks. I said, "Yeah, Dad." I really am. I want to be clear about something. That phone call did not fix anything. There is no single phone call that repairs what years of quiet rejection builds up. My father and I are not close in the way I used to hope we might be. My mother and I have not had the longer conversation that would need to happen before any of this makes real sense. My sister have exchanged a handful of texts that are polite and not much more. These things take time, and some of them may not happen at all, and I've made my peace with that in the uncertain ongoing way that you make peace with things that are still in motion. What I know is this. I have a job that I chose because it was right for me, and that turned out to be something I was actually good at, and those 2 things happening together is not something I take for granted. I have colleagues who treat me like a professional. I have a grandmother who orders the same lunch every 3rd Sunday and asks real questions and listens to the answers. I have an apartment in Hamilton with a good view of the escarpment and a kitchen drawer that contains, among other things, A formal letter from my family declaring that I was no longer their concern. I've thought about throwing it out. I probably will, eventually. But not yet. Not because it hurts to look at. It doesn't, not anymore. More because it is, in its strange and bureaucratic way, a record of the moment things became honest, the moment the performance ended and something real had to start. The morning after my father called, I went in for an early shift. The department was busy from the minute I walked in. There was a pediatric case that needed careful management, a discharge that took longer than expected, a family in the waiting room who had been there since midnight and needed someone to talk to them clearly and kindly about what came next. I did those things one after another, the way you do. On my break, I stood outside the side entrance with my coffee and watched the sun come up over the escarpment, the sky going pink, and then orange, and then the flat pale blue that means a cold, clear day is coming. A courier van was idling in the ambulance bay. A pigeon was doing its committed, purposeless walk along the curb. I thought about my grandmother's shortbread order, which I hadn't forgotten. I thought about what Devin had said, that it gets quieter, not easier, but quieter. I thought about the look on my mother's face in that restaurant, waiting for me to fall apart, and how I hadn't given her that, and how I was glad. I finished my coffee. I went back inside.